It's Monday morning. I'm Dean Rotbart. This is a very special edition of Monday Morning Radio. First of all, it marks the end of our first 10 years of weekly episodes and begins, obviously, year number 11. For this particular episode, we have gathered a prestigious panel of journalists and sages who are going to talk about a new book, a really thought-provoking new book by Chris Roush called The Future of Business Journalism, Why It Matters for Wall Street and Main Street. Chris, who is the dean and a professor at the Quinnipiac University School of Communications, is also the originator, founder of Talking Biz News. It is a must-read website for journalists and communications professionals who want to stay atop what is happening in the journalism profession. I have four truly distinguished panelists today representing different segments of business journalism and business news organizations in alphabetical order. And I don't know, we tried to figure this out before we started, who the audience is going to be seeing on the screen. So I'm just going to go in alphabetical order, and maybe you can raise your hand, starting with Peter Coy. Peter, raise your hand so people know. I guess your name would be there, but Peter, again, all of these are veteran, well-established, respected journalists. Peter is the opinion economics writer for the New York Times. Next is Henry Dubroff. Henry, owner and founder of Pacific Coast Business Times. My hat's off to you, Henry. I am very fond of people who are able to start their own news organizations and sustain them. So thank you for being there. Matt Murray, who is the honored editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, and a Medill alum, so close to my heart. And we have Matt Quayle, who is senior executive producer at CNBC television. If you want the full bios on these people, we're going to post them at Monday Morning Radio, but you can also find them at tinyurl.com/Monday Morning Radio Future. That's tinyurl.com/Monday Morning Radio Future. And we will tell you everything you might ever want to know about each of our panelists and about Chris. Before we talk about the future of business journalism, I thought it might make some sense to start by talking about the past. And what I would like to do is ask each of our participants today to tell us when and where they began as business journalists. So what was your first job and when in business journalism? We'll go again. Chris, we'll start with you.
My first job in business journalism was in 1989 at the Sarasota Herald Tribune in Florida. And at the time, the Herald Tribune was owned by the New York Times Company. And I covered everything from Tropicana to Port Manatee to some boat builders like Chris Craft and Wellcraft and Donzi. And I honestly had no idea what I was doing, but it was a job.
Welcome to the team. Okay, Peter, first job, where and when?
I started out not doing business at all. In fact, I remember when I worked for my college paper, I thought there was something unseemly or wrong about putting company names into stories as if I was somehow giving them free publicity. It wasn't until I got out into the real world that I realized, well, business is very much a part of life. And when I really started doing business journalism was 3 years after college, when I became the correspondent for Associated Press in Rochester, established a correspondency there, and I covered Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, Corning Glassworks in the southern tier of upstate New York, Canandaigua Wine Company, and so on, and just was fascinated. That led a few years later to a job with the AP Business News in New York City, and that's been my specialty ever since, business and finance and economics.
What year did you begin at AP Rochester?
That was 82, 1982.
Okay. Henry.
Well, my first encounter with business journalism, real encounter with business journalism, was as a student at that other place, Columbia University. And I was in a economics reporting seminar, and they asked me to go down to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and figure out why the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates to reduce inflation. It was the other inflationary time. It was the fall of 1981. And I didn't know what I was doing. And they gave me a pamphlet called "This is Money." And they said, this is the only copy of this that we have. So you have to go to the Xerox machine and make a copy. And standing in front of me in the line was a tall guy with kind of cowboy boots, but wearing a suit. And I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, "You wouldn't happen to be a monetary economist, would you?" And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am." And then I said, "Well, why is the Federal Reserve having such a hard time getting a handle on the money supply? And why is that causing the markets to go crazy?" And he said, "Oh, that." He said, "Well, we count the money every day in all the checking accounts. And then we divide by 7 and get a weekly number for M1. And on weeks when Social Security deposits come in on a Friday, the money sits in checking accounts over the weekend, and it drives our statistics crazy. And we can't make it work." And so I dashed back on the one train back to my apartment, wrote it up for the Columbia News Service, and called a couple people, actually talked to Alan Greenspan's partner, Kathy Townsend, who confirmed that this was, in fact, a statistical quirk. And that taught me that there was a lot about business. First of all, it was fascinating. Secondly, I was in the heart, the belly of the beast of public policy. And it was all about arithmetic. And that just captivated me. And from there, I just kind of went from thing to thing to thing. My first serious newspaper job was at the Springfield newspapers in Massachusetts. I did a little work building databases for Venture magazine when I was at Columbia, just to earn some spending money. But it was that encounter that kind of changed everything for me. I also got the best score in the class on that paper. So
Give me
that
the
was
year.
good.
What year were you doing this at Columbia?
81, 82.
81, 82. Matt Murray, where were your roots?
Well, I have a story a little bit like Peter's with a couple of twists. When I graduated college in '87, and I went to Gear for grad school, but the top student in my class in '87 went right to work at the Wall Street Journal. And I remember thinking, man, that sounds deadly dull. Man, how boring is that? And in fact, in 1987, the Wall Street Journal famously was pretty gray as a newspaper, and everything was just added to that. So I was much like Peter, I had interest in other things. At some point, about 5 years later, I was a police reporter in Chicago, and I happened to get a chance to interview for a job at the Journal as a reporting assistant. And I didn't get the job. But by that point, I'd been out and about, and I realized, one, the Journal was an incredibly well-written, intelligent, engaging newspaper, and you can't say that about all newspapers. I like the level of the writing and sophistication. And two, as I read it, I thought it's really full of incredibly relevant, important, mainstream stories that aren't getting covered by others because they're seen as business stories, which I'm sure is something we'll talk about today. But that a lot of the stories were more relevant to what was happening in the world than many other kinds of coverage in journalism, which is something I feel passionate about. And so as I started to read the Journal and build ties, I thought, well, maybe this is a place I'd be interested in going. And I was working at the Daily Press in Newport News, Virginia, which was owned by Tribune Company at that point. And I was a police reporter there. Lovely. I came home one night. I will vividly remember, to my little apartment downtown, and a body had washed up on the beach by my apartment building. So I had to report on that. But I started doing business reporting there, and I took a business beat, and eventually was, fortunate enough to get into the Journal as an entry-level reporter sometime later. But it was really started in Newport News.
What year?
I was in the daily press for about 2 years, from 92 to 94. I went to the Journal in 94, starting in our Pittsburgh bureau.
Matt,
Well, I guess if you're going to label me a journalist as a television producer, my story is pretty boring because it's a 30-year story in the same building. I started as an intern at Rutgers. When I was at Rutgers, I panicked halfway through my sophomore year. It was actually a girl who made me panic, who was one of the editors of the paper, the Daily Targum at Rutgers at the time. It's like, how many internships do you have? I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't have any internships. I don't know what I'm going to do in my life. So she told me about she's on her third, blah, 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 and you got to get going. You got to get in the business. So the next day I went to the cooperative education program at Rutgers. I said, well, I'm a communications major. What do you got? And they're flipping through because I was actually in the environmental school at Rutgers for all kinds of different reasons. My dad was a biology teacher. And they're like, well, communications, we don't know anything about communications if you're in the environmental school, but they're flipping through it anyway. And they're going, oh, look, there's this new TV station that just opened in New Jersey a few months ago. Let me call them. CNBC had just opened in Fort Lee. So they sent up a call and I went up the next day and I interviewed and I got a job as an intern for the summer there. And that immediately gave me my life passion and work, because I knew right at that moment this is what I was going to do. Ended up graduating and getting hired at CNBC in the fall of 1992, and worked my way up for a few years, just learning basic television production. Didn't know anything about business. I just wanted a TV job. Still probably don't know anything about business compared to you guys, but and then I would say that you can maybe label me more of a producer / journalist by 1995, when I kind of moved up and worked on some different shows, and then kind of wrote a memo about a new way to try to do television in the morning, because we were all very frustrated at the time, because everything was very scripted back then, and you would get reports in the morning about, upgrades and downgrades on Wall Street, but you wouldn't be able to actually talk about it the way we do now on television. So I was very frustrated with this production technique. So we kind of proposed a new idea. The new idea ended up being Squawk Box, and the show has been on now since we launched on August 7th, 1995. So I'll call that my date where I became a faux journalist, because we were actually producing television that at the time we felt was groundbreaking and different and new, and a new way to get financial news on the air and help investors understand what to do with their money. So that's my story. I've been here for 30 years since. I did Squawk Box for many, many years, played around with did some other shows, did Kudlow and Kramer for a few years, went back, and now I'm working on new production techniques and launching new shows and new segments within shows, and looking a lot at the data that we put on the air, stuff like that.
all of that is good foundation. What I'm going to do, I try to make notes here. Excuse me. I try to make notes here. There's a sort of head-to-head race between Peter and Henry of who's been a business journalist the longest. But I'm going to go with Peter here. And Peter, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to go through everybody again. Then we're going to get to the future. But just to go through everybody once more. So, what has changed the most in business journalism, Peter, since you started with the AP in Rochester? What do you see as being the most dramatic differences between where we are today, 2022, and where you were, 40 years ago?
I'd say it's more antagonistic now, the relationship between journalists and their sources in business, which is part of the trends in society as a whole and journalism as a whole. You see it in the fact that companies are hard to reach. Just trying to go to a company website and try to get the PR, try to get a CEO on the line for a phone call. It just, they're much less interested than they used to be in getting their message out via those of us in the room, the video room. There, it's not. I don't feel antagonistic towards business. I'm a big supporter. I'm a big believer in the value of business, but I get the sense that there's a lot of suspicion when I call. That was true when I was at Business Week, then Bloomberg Business Week, and now at the New York Times. It's not where I'm coming from. It's just maybe antagonism is too strong a word, but it's a sense of caution that there's quite a bit of a distance there. And I mean, just today I was on the phone all afternoon with people from I know the American Petroleum Institute and the refiners trade group, talking about high gasoline and diesel prices, and my head trying to do a fairly sympathetic take. And so once you get past the initial suspicion, I find that you can establish a good working relationship, but the immediate assumption is to be on guard when a journalist calls. I don't think it used to be quite so much that way in the past.
Henry, I saw you shaking your head a bit as Peter was talking about reaching people. Would you characterize that as what has changed the most? What do you think has changed the most since you started?
Well, I do think I would point to three things. One, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later, is the hollowing out of the regional or metropolitan daily newspaper, which has really sort of removed this kind of middle ground, middle market, whatever you want to call it, from the equation. So for a lot of CEOs or executives, they don't get the exposure. I mean, they're either talking to a publication like ours, the local business journal, or they're talking to a big national publication or Bloomberg, Dow Jones, Market Watch. Sorry, Bloomberg's not here. But they're not getting experience. So of course they're a bit more defensive. And the second thing I would say is the Reg FD has really made it a lot of CEOs gun shy, and it puts them. I'll say it's put reporters a little bit on guard. This is the SEC rule that really about disclosing material, non-public information. We used to have lots of conversations with our local CEOs. They would be on panels. A lot of times they're reluctant to do that even. I had a visit with an avocado distributor that went public in 2020. I hadn't talked to him. And finally, his son kind of called me and said, hey, my dad's still here. He's still the same. He's having a good time. Why don't you come down and take a look? And we reconnected. So there's that, the space of Reg FD. And the third thing, I think Peter's absolutely right about the websites. They're really hard to navigate. You really can't find things. I think you really have to be clever about how you use phone trees and other things in order to actually reach real people. Even when you have a personal connection, you lose the email of somebody. And it's like, holy crap, how am I going to find this? And it just didn't used to be that hard.
Chris, 1989 to now.
I agree with what Peter and Henry have said, but the one thing that it immediately struck into my mind when you asked the question is the internet. Because I am old enough to remember when I wanted an SEC filing of a company, you had to write a letter and mail a check to a company in Washington called Disclosure, and they would go get the filing for you and mail it back to you. And now you can get SEC filings almost immediately for any publicly traded company. So when I think of the biggest change in business journalism, I think of how you no longer have to do things like that. You no longer have to go, for a lot of examples, you no longer have to go to the courthouse to get a UCC filing, for example, for a company to see if they've taken out a loan. You no longer have to go to the courthouse to, in a lot of cases, to get a lawsuit or to get a document that a company or an executive has had to file. So it's really sped up, in my mind, their reporting aspect of the job. In that, in 1989, 1990, when I started, when you heard a story might be in a company's SEC filing, it would take you a week at the most or at the best to get that document. And today you can probably get it in about 5 minutes on the internet. So I realize there's a lot of negative things about the internet, what the internet has meant to journalism, but it's also improved the speed at which stories can be reported.
I'm going to change my answer. I want to take Chris's answer. I like his better than mine.
Okay, we'll give him credit.
But I totally agree with Peter
Yeah.
about executives being much harder to get in touch with today.
Matt Murray.
I think I actually have an answer that might connect you, Peter, with Chris, because I think obviously I think everything that's been said is true, but I think the internet is the key to a lot of different things. So part of why is the company relationship with the press changed? Because they don't need the press in the same way they did 30 years ago. They have their direct audience to people. They put out their press releases. I was at Big Bank this week where I did a panel, and companies of a certain size, they have their own content generating internal news studios and other things now, and they try to reach people directly because anybody can be a publisher on the internet. So the interlocutor function that the press played in the past, for better and worse, I think in good ways and bad ways, but that sort of gatekeeper role has been completely wiped out. On the reporting front, I'll amplify something Chris said too, which is there are other tools that are helpful in reporting. LinkedIn is a big one. You can tap into these networks of people and employees. And I think one thing interesting about the internet, again, in good and bad ways, is it's made CEOs might be harder to get, but other people's willingness to speak out and talk about companies or dish is probably higher than it used to be. And the company's ability to sort of control what comes out is lessened from what it used to be. Again, that has its own complications. So in all kinds of ways, the internet is woven throughout all of these changes. I would just note one other thing. I think, broadly in the period when everyone on the podcast here got into business journalism, how people felt about business and how it was being covered and the place it was playing in culture and society was different than it is now. Starting in the 80s and then going into the 90s, we had setbacks and bad moments, but it was a relatively placid and in the 90s, especially prosperous time. And so the drama of business, the excitement of business figures, the leadership of CEOs, the way they were looked at and talked about was very central to the culture. Again, in ways that created opportunities for business journalism, but also sometimes some of those figures and some of those stories weren't critically covered enough. And it was a time when it was a spectator sport. Chris writes about this in his book a little bit. And today we're living in a society where everybody still works at a company, people still follow business. There are still prominent figures and CEOs, but politics infuses much more. How people view their companies and businesses or big business has changed. What they want from the media or expect from the media has changed some. And so the cultural place of business, while important, has shifted for a lot of the consumers. And I think that's another thing worth talking about.
Matt Quayle, obviously the technology has just dramatically changed. You were just telling us before we were officially recording about how CNBC was able to stay on the air, what did you say, 14 hours a day with most of the people working from home. So clearly the technology of cable television and live cable television has changed, but what about the content? Have you seen?
Well, I'll turn what Peter said upside down.
Okay.
And I'll do it not because I'm trying to counteract what Peter said, but to show the difference, I think, in the different media
Segments.
venues, which is he's saying that the relationship with CEOs is more antagonistic. They don't want to come on the air. They don't want to come. They don't want to be quoted. They don't want to be put in print. If you went back to, I remember when we launched Squawk Box, we sat there and we said, okay, here's the deal. Our goal is going to be that we're going to be the first show that puts on a CEO of a publicly traded company. Can we get one CEO a week? That was our big goal. So the first week, I don't think we got an actual CEO. I think we got John Goodfriend, who was the former CEO of Salomon Brothers at the time, but he was very controversial. So we thought we had this big thing. And then I don't think we got another one for another 2 or 3 weeks before we finally got a second CEO. Watch CNBC's programming now, 25, 30 years later, like half the guests on CNBC are CEOs. So there's a difference in different media and where these people are going and why they're choosing those one venue over another. You can make a million arguments of why they would do that. Some of it would be instant, maybe. Some of it would be public relations. They want to put their face out for some reason, or the public relations office within the company feels that's the best way to handle it. But there's clearly no, even in bad news situations, the CEOs often will want to come on television, right, as a choice for how they're getting their message out. So I don't know what that's saying to the panel, and I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying it's just an observation that we couldn't get a CEO 25, 30 years ago, and now we pretty much can get anybody we want. From a CEO perspective, there was a big story. We call them. Generally, they're going to come in some way or another, or at least engage with the company and give us some information. So I don't know why we could discuss that as a media ecology reason for why this has changed, but it has changed. There's no doubt.
I think it's an important observation, and let's not take the time right now to discuss or debate why. Let's just keep it out there as a observation. One of the things that several of you mentioned, and I wonder if it's still true today, is that when you started in business journalism, you didn't know anything about business journalism. And so are the new journalists coming into the profession today as uninformed as you guys were when you started, or has the bar been raised? And is the knowledge base, I don't even know, maybe it's fair to ask whether the caliber of today's new business journalists is much different than what the caliber was when you guys were starting out. Anyone want to take that?
I think the caliber at the upper level publications is much better. But I think that at lower regional or city publications, it's not any better than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And we really have not seen an increase in higher education, which is where I'm at right now, focusing on business journalism as something that needs to be taught, even though there's obviously a demand for college students to be trained in this field. But at the higher levels, I mean, next week I'm doing Dow Jones News Fund training for a lot of Matt's interns and some other Dow Jones publications. And some of them, I would say about half of them are coming from universities that actually have business journalism programs. But they're also going to Wall Street Journal or Barron's or Market Watch.
I'd amplify one point. I think that's important to we've talked a little bit already about the decline, very steep decline, I think, of local papers and business. I don't know exactly. I'll give you the example I like to use is in 2001. So 21 years ago, our aerospace reporter, Jeff Cole, was killed on a story. He got on an experimental plane with a CEO he was writing about. The plane went up, it crashed in 30 seconds, and both of them were killed. And Boeing at the Wall Street Journal was a pretty important beat. And to fill the job in 2001, we had our pick of 5 or 6 local reporters because Boeing was such an important company and employer. The Seattle papers had a few Boeing reporters, Chicago, Texas. These days, that kind of pool just doesn't exist anymore. And one of the other things which we haven't talked about is all of this universe in the 80s and 90s of specialty magazines like Bond Buyer and credit magazines and publications that filled the world, where people could get basic starting out in journalism. You go work at American Banker and you really learn the ins and outs of banking for a couple of years, and then you go elsewhere. That's another climate and environment that's really been decimated quite a bit. So my take often here, and I suspect it's similar for Bloomberg or others, is that the overall quality and caliber of young people coming to the journal is higher than it used to be. They're better trained overall. They're professional. They're certainly more mature and more put together than I was when I was a few years older than they were. And they're eager and willing to learn, and they're capable of learning. But what they bring in often in terms of business knowledge or awareness of business or deep nuance is no greater than it was. And in some cases might be less. They might have more that they have to learn on the job in the specifics.
Matt, would you hire your younger self today at the Journal?
I don't know that I would. I mean, when I joined the Journal in '94, the place the Journal held was different and the competitive environment was different. We really were the national business daily. That was pre-digital, right? We actually got the internet and put it on our computers in the office the next year. And so I had some leisure to learn balance sheets, to write stories. I was surrounded by good editing. We weren't on a 24/7 intense news cycle that we live on today. And the Journal, had a long tradition of covering business, but also, developing really deep, long, rich feature stories that could take months and months and months to cover and report. And competition wasn't an issue or a concern. And you could really work on those muscles. Now, we still run long, deep, rich feature stories. I think we still have a great tradition of that. And hopefully we've updated that and made it relevant. But, timeliness and urgency and competition just matter in a way that they didn't used to matter in the internet, because anybody can be a publisher or get news out there. And so the demands on other reporters today coming in are frankly a lot higher than they were on me.
Henry, you have to find qualified journalists. You probably, I'm assuming you certainly can't claim the circulation of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the viewership of CNBC. How difficult is it to find quality journalists for you?
Recently it has not been that hard. And part of it is that there's now a kind of a word on the street about business journals that they've kind of moved into the kind of stepping stone position that the local daily or regional daily once occupied. We definitely see young reporters coming our way who've had internships, often at another business journal. So at least they know the ropes and the culture, and they have some good technology skills. I still say business journalism, all of journalism, but particularly business journalism, is a learning by doing job until you've actually had to type out, and made your first typo of billions versus millions, or got earnings per share wrong, or got, a decline in earnings as a loss confused, and had an editor take you aside and say, hey, this is how it works. It's learning by doing, and that is not going to change about our profession until we install bots to do the writing, which I don't think is going to happen, at least in my lifetime. I do think I was going to say that we actually have hired people from our daily newspaper, and that's a trend that was unthinkable 20 years ago when I started the Business Times, and they're really happy. I think one of the things that's happening just at your local paper is hiring very raw talent right out of college folks, because they're willing to work for very low pay, and they don't care if the paper folds in a few years, or if the internet drives it out of business, or if there are more job cuts, because they'll just go on and do something else.
Chris, let me ask you a question. If you had to define business journalism today, would the definition be significantly different than when this panel started? Has business journalism as an institution evolved in terms of what is business journalism?
I think it has evolved in a couple of ways. To me, one of the biggest trends is, I think, something that Matt mentioned earlier, and that is, at least my experience and what I've heard from journalists or business journalists over the years, is lower level employees used to be much more difficult to talk to, and now they seem more vocal and more willing to disclose what's going on at their companies. And so I guess in terms of an evolution, I've seen that in terms of who your sources are at a company. Back in the late 80s and 90s, it was more the top executives. And I think now it's more lower level. And again, obviously technology has changed how companies and how businesses are reported, and that there were stories that we didn't even think about covering in the 80s or 90s that are major stories today, like how social media companies are affecting society either positively or negatively. I don't think we really thought a whole lot back in the 90s when Peter and I, for example, were working at Business Week together about what the societal impact of a big company was, as much as how I'm seeing it covered today.
Chris, you wrote, again, the book is The Future of Business Journalism and Why It Matters for Wall Street and Main Street. You wrote in the book that the conclusion, because you gave an example to be drawn here, is that many local media news organizations have gotten away from covering business and economics that's important to their readers, and are simply filling their websites with content that they think might result in someone clicking out of curiosity. So that's not business journalism anymore, is it?
That's not. And it's sad to me, because I no longer read my local newspaper because it doesn't have the business news that I want, which is what's happening in the local economy. It doesn't tell me anything about what businesses are growing or contracting. It doesn't tell me about whether the state is offering any sort of financial incentives for a company to expand. In Connecticut here, I'm aware of a major movie production house that is building a huge studio in New Haven, and is going to be employing hundreds of people. And that's not been reported in the local newspaper. But I know about it because they've reached out to us because they want to hire graduates.
Chris, one of the biggest questions that I have in my mind after reading your book, The Future of Business Journalism, is whether or not for-profit journalism is a efficient market. If there is a large number of unserved Main Street businesses, individuals who really used to look to the media to get important information that's actionable, or at least it informs them. And that's gone away to a large extent, which is, I think, you're part of what you argue in the book. Then why hasn't some enterprising for-profit organization stepped up and filled that role? If there's demand for it, let me just give you one quick statistic, and then I'd like anybody's take on this. This is from Axios, May 16, 2022. The average number of social media interactions per published article by select topic. By far the topic most interesting, Axios found, was the Heard Depp trial. Then followed by Elon Musk, Joe Biden, abortion, the Russian-Ukraine war. Someplace at about 1/8 of the Heard Depp trial is inflation, and then about half of that is COVID-19. So I look at that, and I look at your book, and I ask myself, do people even know what they need, and is there a demand for it? If there is, why isn't somebody filling it? Chris, start with you, but I'd like anybody's take on it.
I mean, Dean, you've raised a great question. I think there would be a demand if somebody kind of came in and filled that void. I think it's happening in small places, but not widespread. I think Axios, for what it's doing in some local markets, is actually trying to address this problem. What you just quoted from Axios about what people are reading is part of the problem, in that I think people get distracted because there is so much information out there today that they go for the cheap news, for lack of a better term, instead of what's probably most important to them in their daily lives. But I do think money. I'm a firm believer, as Peter said at the beginning. I'm a firm believer in the capitalistic, society. I think, particularly in business journalism, if you do it right on a local basis, you could probably make a lot of money doing it.
Matt Coyle, let me ask you, how much, for Squawk Box, for other programs, how much is there a debate, a discussion behind the scenes that says, this is an important topic, but it's probably going to just die in the ratings. It's not easy, versus, if we could get Warren Buffett on again, we know it's a home run. I mean, how close to being what the internet is, where people are offering clickbait, how close to that is, or how far from that is programming on CNBC?
Well, let me step back for a second. I think, like in the CNBC model, what we're experiencing is a change in the audience and how they're digesting news, right? So for my audience, right, it's television. But for the next generation, maybe the next generation, they're clicking on CNBC.com more than they're watching me. So I think CNBC is trying to figure out how to service the core business that we have built over 25 years, which is the television business, right? That's what CNBC is mostly known for. But if you look at all our growth metrics, all our growth is in all these new mediums, right? And that's where the kids are going out of college. They're not coming to me anymore. They're going to there. They're going right down the hallway to CNBC.com, or they're going to CNBC Social, or they're going to the CNBC events business, where now we're producing these events that people, because the events business is kind of taken off in the same way, like, concerts have been taking off. Like people want a live experience and they want to be part of it. So I think it's kind of more about how the industry is kind of morphing and changing, and generationally, just like print, television, now internet and social, right? It's serving all those things under one uniform umbrella. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing, and probably everyone on this panelist company is facing it in some way. I'm going to get excited the moment I know Warren Buffett's coming on the show, right? It's going to be a huge event for me as a television producer. This is a big deal. This is the hugest thing in my universal world, but not necessarily in CNBC.com's world, right? And here we are, the same organization covering it the same, in theory, why isn't it the same home run for the same brand? But because it's a different audience, and figuring out who your audience is and how it's changing over time and how certain audiences are aging and new ones are coming in, I think is probably a lot of what you guys are talking about, or some of what we're observing between the idea of local business news and national business news, which seems to be at the heart of a lot of this.
Peter, I'll come to you in 1 second. Matt Murray, you must have what Matt Quayle just described very much on your mind in terms of a large audience, your digital audience, there's television audience. I mean, how do you reconcile it, especially in terms of, so do you reconcile it by having very segmented staffing issues? You have people who are it used to be the Wall Street Journal had a separate staff for online. I mean, we're going back a couple of decades.
Yeah.
For online, and then you've got Dow Jones News Service, and then you had, the Wall Street Journal syndicated TV. How do you navigate those waters these days?
Well, it can be complicated in the newsroom to have the ability to reach people in different ways with different story formats, as Matt was suggesting, and trying to reach younger readers. And I think the key is that speed and relevance is important everywhere, and you've got these tools now to measure how they do. I would say, though, I do want to say, though, I think that for the big organizations, most of us on this call are big organizations. Most of us are. We have things pretty good relative to the rest of the ecosystem. We're large companies. We have deep pockets. One of the issues facing small outlets today is the barrier to entry used to be, can you afford to have a printing press? Well, you don't need that anymore, but if you're really going to compete, you need technology, you need audio, you need video, you need text, you need expertise across a lot of media and the ability to give a high quality product out to people. And that's incredibly challenging for lots of smaller news organizations, which has been one of their issues. So, to some extent, I'd like to think some of the need that you're identifying, or that we've talked a little about, for readers needing certain kinds of business coverage, that the Journal is, candidly, we're benefiting from that. Our circulation is the largest it's ever been. Our reach is the broadest it's ever been. We've expanded how we think about business journalism and money more and more and more over time, and made it more accessible and more useful, and all kinds of things resonate. So for us, there's a lot that is fortunate for us. The last thing I'd say is that part of what's happening in the background of all this, though, is that, economically speaking, that sort of shift in the news business, that barbell thing, where some small niche providers are doing well and specific ones at large companies are doing well, but the middle's gotten squeezed out. And even there in this country, if you think about it, if you added up, the three biggest dailies are the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I think we're all the biggest that we've ever been in numbers by a wide margin. We're all national in a way that wasn't the case 2 generations ago. All of us, you add up our subscribers, were, well south of 20 million in a nation of 330 million people. So, that's part of the challenge too, that you've identified throughout, Dean, of how do you break through to people? What do they want? do they want it? Those are good questions for us always to be asking.
Peter, you had something you wanted to comment on, and then I have a question for you. So,
Okay, so I since I started writing my newsletter for the opinion section of the New York Times this past August, I've gotten more direct feedback than ever before about what works and what doesn't work and what I do. And when I say work, I mean who's reading it and responding to it. And I've become more sensitive to the need to reach out to readers where they are and to meet them halfway, not just to throw out an article because I think it's important, or but to say, okay, what's going to get people to actually get past the headline and read, respond. So when I say meeting readers halfway, you mentioned that list of top stories. Elon Musk was number 2 on the list. Okay, so that's a business story, and you're a fool not to take advantage of people's inherent interest in Elon Musk to delve into all kinds of stories surrounding Elon Musk, such as what's the nature of Twitter, what are the SEC rules, what acquisitions, you know. There are 100 stories that you can write off of Elon Musk. That I have an analogy I like to use about journalism, which is I compare it to being the operator of a hydroelectric power plant. So the news, the events of the world are the river. And we are, as journalists, put up a dam, put in turbines, and capture electricity from that flow of events and news. Why not? It's free. It's also doesn't cause greenhouse gas emissions. So go after the stories that are out there. Find a way to make them engaging, because a great story that's not read is not a great story.
I have a question for you, but I just want to comment. So the forum for this conversation is the weekly podcast that I do. It's Monday Morning Radio. And as I told you, the vast majority of the people who subscribe and listen are small business owners. And every week I know how many people downloaded or streamed a topic. So I've completed 10 years. It's about 500 podcasts that I've hosted for small business owners. And I have the whole variety. I really love to have actual small business owners telling me about their businesses. So for example, this coming Monday, this is being taped in advance, but on Monday, May 23rd, my podcast will feature Brian Scudamore. Brian Scudamore was a high school dropout who founded 1-800-GOT-JUNK. It's now worth $600 million. It's a now $600 million a year business. Well, he's a fascinating person. He has an awful lot to share with my listeners about what they should know and what they shouldn't know. But his listenership, the number of people who will stream and download his podcast, is a fraction of the listenership that I get when I have Ken Blanchard on, the 1 Minute Manager, who talks about leadership and entrepreneurship, or Charles Duhigg, who, the power of habit. When I have those guests on, I can actually measure how many more people listen. So it goes out, the podcast goes out every week to the subscriber list, 65,000 plus. But clearly not 65,000 plus listen to every podcast. And it's those ratings, if you will, that still tell me, and Chris, I'll go back to you, Peter, I'll come back to you with a question, but that still tells me so what's going on here? The people who listen are already small business owners. They are Main Street businesses. They're the people you are very concerned about in your book, The Future of Business Journalism. But when you put out something like Brian Scudamore, I don't get the same response as Matt Quayle talks about. You get Warren Buffett on, and wow, what do you think about that, Chris?
I think that journalism has made a critical error in the past 20 years, in that we have slowly but surely stopped providing that small business owner what they really need to operate that small business. Like, what is happening to consumer confidence in their city? Or is there a strip mall being bought or being built around the block that might affect their competition? And we've replaced that coverage slowly but surely with, and I'm going to use your term, Dean, clickbait, and things that are eye-catching to them. And so, really the only publications that I see today that are actually providing that small business owner, not the Fortune 500 companies, but this very small business owner with what they need, are publications like Henry's, that really focus on that local community. And we've got to correct that.
When Chris writes, Peter, I want to ask you about this. Chris writes in the book, business journalism has evolved to cover important topics that only a small fraction of society cares about. And they have also ignored or downplayed many stories that have a broad impact across all readers, listeners, and viewers. When it comes to your columns in your newsletter, Peter, how much are you thinking about whether you're appealing to the masses and the needs of the masses, or you're appealing to the elite? And one would argue, and I think Chris does argue in the book, that the New York Times is one of the top five. What you've got: the Journal, you've got Reuters, you've got Bloomberg, you've got the Financial Times, and you've got the New York Times, but that doesn't cover, again, for shorthand, Main Street America.
I plead guilty to some degree that I'm not writing stories about how you can save money by clipping coupons or by buying day-old bread. It's not my audience. If I do personal finance, but it tends to be pitched, more at people who are fairly well-to-do, and that's the audience. I need to appeal to people who are reading the stuff. On the other hand, if it's not personal finance, but it's more, so I have a combination. I do the personal finance, which is, I could write personal finance every newsletter and probably vastly expand my readership, because that's the stuff that probably gets some of the best reaction. People are really hungry for that, but I don't want to have a steady diet of that. So I'll do some of that. And again, it's aimed at the particular interests of millionaire readers who subscribe to my newsletter. But then I'll do stuff like, how should we restructure the SNAP program or something like that, supplemental nutritional assistance program, which are for a whole different audience, the earned income tax credit. Or like, I'm working on a piece now about growing bamboo in Nepal. Now, these are very poor people. So it's not like I don't care about the plight of the vast population of the country, but you got to hit them. You got to figure out two things, like who are your readers, and then how do you get your readers to care about a lot of stuff outside of their immediate circumstances. Sometimes you give them exactly what they're looking for, and sometimes you try to pull them, try to get them to look at a wider view. One last thing, Chris and I both worked for Business Week under Steve Shepard, and he used to talk about his job as a magazine editor was to give people stuff that they didn't necessarily go looking for, that there had to be an element of serendipity. So if you're a computer executive, you'd be reading the marketing or the energy sections of the magazine, and you would learn stuff from them. So I kind of try to do a little bit of that on a sole proprietor basis, giving people a lot of subjects, some that they naturally care about and some that you have to induce them to care about.
Henry, tell me how conscious you are of any dailies that are in your readership circulation area, and are you spending more and more energy and time putting out daily internet articles as opposed to the weekly print publication?
Oh, without question, digital has shifted our priorities, and every business journal in the country is asking its reporters to produce, one or two daily web updates a day just off what's going on. And, again, and we don't really pay very much attention at all to what the dailies are doing unless they're doing something, absolutely extraordinary. Day in, day out, we count on being ahead of them. I would say there is a kind of an ecosystem, and one of the things we're talking about, and Chris, I think you've stumbled on this in a kind of a brilliant way, is the fact that the ecosystem that's driving the large organizations generates a lot of attention on the internet, but it's relatively small, even in financial news. And, when you scale that down to our communities, again, we have an ecosystem of about 100, 150 companies, maybe 400 or 500 kind of business, economic thought leaders. We talk to them constantly. That's kind of our beat. That's how we kind of do that. And that's been what's kept the business journal world alive. And occasionally those ecosystems intersect, like when our the trade desk CEO got paid $895 million, that made it onto Bloomberg and CNBC, and front page of the Wall Street Journal. But they don't always intersect. So understanding these ecosystems a little better would be, I think, worth some study. I would add, there was some talk earlier about whether this locally, I think you can do a lot with experimental, very small, nimble organizations. But you have to be really clever about it. Subscription models sometimes work. I work in Colorado with a group called the Colorado Media Project that's been experimenting with many different models. And one thing I would say is that there's a real question about whether nonprofits are such a great idea to be owners of publications, because you owe things to your funders, no matter who they are, or whether it makes more sense for community foundations and others with resources to support nonprofits or to support local news, even local business news, by purchasing advertising, by sponsoring events, by even grants to support certain types of coverage like healthcare, because that seems like a much better way to sustain a for-profit model.
Chris, I want to come to you. Obviously part of the book, in the book, you kind of diagnose the problem. You talk about the impact that it's having on Wall Street and Main Street, and then you have some recipes for what you think the business journalism profession institution ought to do. And Henry just mentioned this. I'm curious as to how important you think nonprofit news organizations are to the future of business journalism, and also, and then I'd like to get others' take on it, also the idea of having these super rich benefactors, to have Jeff Bezos, funding the Washington Post, Lauren Powell Jobs, who's actually involved in a couple of the Atlantic and a couple of news organizations. Is that the future of business journalism?
I think they have a place, and I think they're very helpful, particularly in terms of helping to fund startup news organizations. But I mean, I still believe wholeheartedly in the fact that you can make money in this business of producing business news and business journalism. And I think, the Wall Street Journal and CNBC and the New York Times and all of the big publications have shown that and they do an excellent job of providing the business news and economics news to their specific readers. But what is not being done is changing that model or adjusting that model and providing that same local business and economics news to the small business owner that are your primary listeners and that are Henry's primary readers. That's the problem, is that the media industry has not figured out that people need and want business news and economics news, and that it's important to them, and that they are willing to pay for it. You know, to me, one of the biggest mistakes in the media industry of the past 20 years is when the daily newspapers started having problems. The first thing they cut was business news content, and they cut it during the 2007 and 2008 economic crisis in this country, when people needed that news and information the most. That just was counterintuitive and wrong and dumbheaded. You know, I can't remember now who said it, but you know, I guess it was Peter talking about our old boss Steve Shepard. But you know, if you give the reader or the consumer the news that they need, they will consume it, even if they don't know that they need it.
Matt Murray, one of the things we actually haven't said that has changed, I think, relatively significantly over a few decades is the ownership of news organizations. And so we no longer have, the Washington Post is no longer owned by the Graham family that made its money in the news business. The Los Angeles Times by the Chandler family. The Wall Street Journal is a little bit different in the sense that it's no longer the Cox-Barron family, but it's at least run by somebody, Rupert Murdoch, who is a news publisher, as opposed to something like Alden Global Capital, which Sam Zell, others, people who looked at news organizations and said, we think we can make money here. There's real estate underpinning the organization. And really what's happened is they have come in, they have accumulated news organization after news organization, paired the staff, and they have the safety net of the real estate. In your mind, Matt, how influential has that been on the quality of business journalism?
Well, it's complicated. I guess I would say first, you know, in many ways, having strong business people as individual owners more often, the Jeff Bezos example comes to mind, is a reversion in some ways to the past. You know, the period in the post-war when most media companies were owned by or most newspapers were owned by sort of public media companies that had sort of, in some ways, a spirited-minded media mindset, but also had a good business going, and they had kind of a lock on local print advertising, and they had the economics to be able to do it. In some ways, that was an anomaly and was not going to probably last forever. So you're back to a place that we were more common in the old days. I mean, even when the Sulzbergers bought the New York Times, they weren't, you know, the Sulzbergers of today's exactly, right? So these things can evolve. I think what's different about the I guess the thing about Alden Capital or some of these more rapacious hedge funds that have come in and stripped the assets that you described is, are they, you know, drivers of the problem or symptoms of the problem? You know, what does Alden Capital do? They buy distressed assets. The asset got distressed before they came in. And so they're doing what hedge funds do and what these entities do. You've got other examples. You've got the Baltimore Banner starting up with a local philanthropist who's eager to try to bolster local journalism. And so, yes, I think that's been bad for business journalism, but I guess no one would defend it as being good, but I think it had already deteriorated to a certain point before the Alden Capitals come along. Can I make one other quick point about the ecosystem? I know I don't want to talk too much. I know we're running short on time. But just one other quick point on the ecosystem, which is we in journalism have our own ecosystem, which is what we as journalists value and what we focus on. This takes me back to where Chris started. there's probably a third as many working journalists making money today as there were 20 years ago. And the industry within has become a little more conformist, and it's a little more influenced by the big players. So we have a lot of journalists, really sincere journalists, who come out and go, I want to cover investigations, or to use the Johnny Depp example, we're going to write all the same story. Part of what makes local journalism thrive is differentiation. People will pay for your product because it's differentiated. And I'm convinced right now, and Chris kind of said it, that what local journalism can do is give you really vibrant, important information about local real estate, local jobs, local developments. And if people could go out and try that, that might really be part of the answer for local journalism. But writing the same stuff everybody else writes, or hiring people who want to do exactly the same kind of thing everybody else does, is clearly not as helpful. So it needs some vision out there to really drive a different kind of a thing and say, this is relevant to people, and prove it. And to the nonprofit point, it's great when nonprofits start organizations, but I'm also a believer that ultimately you'll prove the value of your content if people buy it and pay for it and engage with it. It's good to be tested in the market.
Thank you all for your time. I have many more questions. I would love to ask them, but I've already imposed enough. So that will wrap it up for this panel and this week's edition of Monday Morning Radio. Again, the book is The Future of Business Journalism and Why It Matters for Wall Street and Main Street.
Congratulations, Chris.
Yeah,
Yes, congratulations.
Way to go.
Thanks, guys.
Go out and pick it up. Thank you all.
We'll buy them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good to have everybody. Thank you.